The mountain claimed lives without mercy. But when Margaret Whitmore dragged her husband's frozen body up that ravine, fighting through a blizzard that should have killed them both, she proved that some bonds are forged stronger than death itself. This is a story of two broken souls who found each other in the most unforgiving place on earth, where survival demanded more than strength. It demanded trust. What began as a cold arrangement between strangers became something neither believed possible again. Stay with me until the end of this journey, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The cabin sat like a wound in the mountainside, a rough-hewn structure of logs and stone perched on a ledge where the wind came screaming up from the valley below. Inside, Caleb Stroud sat at a table worn smooth by 20 years of solitary meals, staring at a blank piece of paper as if it were a confession he didn't want to make. His hands, scarred, weathered, the knuckles swollen from decades of cold, gripped the pencil with surprising delicacy. Outside, the November wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, a wolf howled its loneliness to the stars. Caleb knew that sound. He'd been making it himself for years, just quieter. He was 53 years old, and the mountain was starting to win. It wasn't something he'd admit to anyone, least of all himself, but the truth had a way of making itself known in the wilderness. Last winter, he'd slipped on ice crossing the creek and felt something give in his knee. Not break, but shift in a way that promised future failure. 2 weeks ago, hauling a dead elk back to the cabin, he'd had to stop 3 times to catch his breath, his chest tight as a drum. The mountain didn't care about pride. It only cared about weakness. And Caleb Stroud, for the first time in his life, was beginning to feel weak. He set the pencil down and stood, moving to the window. Through the warped glass, he could see the valley spread out below, Pine Hollow, they called it, though there wasn't much of a town. A trading post, a church, a handful of buildings clustered along the creek like they were seeking comfort in numbers. Beyond that, nothing but wilderness stretching to the horizon. He'd come here after the war, after Atlanta and the screaming and the fire, after he'd watched his younger brother die in his arms, blood bubbling through the kid's lips as he tried to speak. After he'd gone home to find his sweetheart married to someone else, someone who hadn't spent 4 years learning how to kill. The mountain had seemed like salvation then, a place where the silence was honest, where survival was simple. You worked, you ate, you slept. You didn't think about the past. You didn't plan for the future. You just existed, day by day, until one day you didn't anymore. 20 years had passed like water through his fingers. But now, standing in the firelight with his knee aching and his breath short, Caleb faced a truth he'd been avoiding. One bad fall. One broken leg. One winter storm that trapped him outside the cabin. That's all it would take. He'd die alone up here. The wolves would find him before anyone from town even noticed he was missing. The thought didn't frighten him exactly. Death was just another kind of silence. But something about it felt wasteful, wrong. He returned to the table and picked up the pencil, to the Western Marriage Agency. His hand moved slowly, each word carved onto the page like he was cutting it into stone. My name is Caleb Stroud. I am 53 years of age, sound of mind if not entirely of body, and I operate a trapline in the mountains above Pine Hollow, Colorado territory. I own my land outright, maintain a sturdy cabin, and provide for myself without debt or obligation to any man. He paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. How did you explain this? How did you say, I need someone to help me not die alone without sounding pathetic? I seek a wife not for romance, but for practical partnership. The mountain is harsh and demands constant work. I can offer shelter, protection, and a share of all I have. In return, I require someone capable of hard labor, skilled in household management, and of strong constitution. A woman who understands that frontier life offers no luxuries, no society, no comfort beyond what we create together. I do not expect affection. I offer respect, fair treatment, and an equal voice in all decisions that affect our survival. If you know of a woman willing to trade the uncertainties of city life for the certainties of mountain hardship, direct her to write to me in care of the Pine Hollow Trading Post. C. Stroud. He read it over once, then folded the paper before he could change his mind. The Trading Post made a run down to Denver once a month, If he gave them the letter tomorrow, maybe, just maybe, by spring? He shook his head. Foolish. What kind of woman would answer such a letter? What kind of desperation drove a person to marry a stranger and climb a mountain to do it? But he sealed the letter anyway and set it on the mantel, next to the rifle and the tin of coffee grounds and all the other necessities that kept him alive. Outside, the wolf howled again. This time, it sounded less lonely. Ot. Chapter 2. The Answer. 300 miles to the east, in a boarding house on the outskirts of St. Louis, Margaret Whitmore sat in a room barely larger than a closet and counted her remaining money for the third time that day. $12.47. She smoothed the bills carefully, then folded them back into the small leather purse that had been a wedding gift from her mother, now 15 years in the grave. The purse was good leather, well made. It had outlasted almost everything else, including her husband. Margaret was 45 years old, and her life had just ended for the second time. The first time had been 3 years ago, when Thomas died. A good man, Thomas Whitmore. Steady, kind, a clerk with the railroad company who'd never risen high but never fallen either. They'd had a modest house, a modest life. No children, that sorrow had followed them through 15 years of marriage, but they'd had each other, and that had been enough, until the pneumonia took him in a week. She'd sold the house to pay his medical debts and the funeral costs. Thomas's family, his brother's family, really, had taken her in with the tight-lipped charity of people fulfilling an obligation they resented. For 2 years, she'd lived in their spare room, helping with the children, mending clothes, making herself useful enough to justify the space she occupied. Then Thomas's brother died in a factory accident, and his widow made it clear there wasn't room for 2 widows under one roof. "We'll need the room for Mother Whitmore," Sarah had said, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. "She can't manage the stairs at her age. You understand." Margaret understood perfectly. She understood she was 45 years old with no husband, no children, no income, and no one who wanted her. The boarding house took most of her remaining money. She'd found work taking in mending, but it paid pennies. Every morning she scanned the newspaper's situations wanted, looking for positions as a housekeeper or companion. Every afternoon she returned to the boarding house with the same result. Too old, no references, positions already filled. The truth sat in her chest like a stone. She was becoming invisible. Women her age, women without family or means, they just disappeared. Into poorhouses, into charity institutions, into unmarked graves when the winter cold and poor nutrition finally finished what poverty had started. Margaret had watched it happen to others. She refused to let it happen to her. That's why, on a cold afternoon in late November, she found herself in the offices of the Western Marriage Agency, climbing a narrow staircase that smelled of mildew and cheap tobacco. The agency occupied 2 rooms above a milliner's shop. A clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his desk as she entered. "May I help you?" Margaret straightened her spine. She'd worn her best dress, the dark blue wool that had been for church before she'd stopped attending. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She looked respectable. She looked capable. She looked desperate, and they both knew it. "I'm inquiring about opportunities in the West." The clerk's expression shifted, not unkind, but businesslike. He'd seen her type before. "We facilitate introductions between gentlemen seeking wives and ladies seeking new situations," he said carefully. "The gentlemen pay a fee for our services. The ladies," he gestured vaguely, "the ladies seek opportunity." "I understand." He opened a ledger, flipped through several pages. "May I ask your age, madam?" 45. His pencil paused just for a moment. Then he made a note. "And your situation?" "Widowed, no children, capable of all household management, cooking, cleaning, sewing, basic nursing. I'm in good health and willing to work. Previous marriage was 15 years. My husband was a railroad clerk. He died of pneumonia 3 years ago." The clerk made more notes, then stood and moved to a filing cabinet. He withdrew several folders, spread them on the desk. "I'll be frank with you, Mrs. Whitmore. Most of our gentlemen seek younger women, women of childbearing age." He said it without cruelty, just stating facts. However, we do have some correspondents who value different qualities: experience, maturity, practical skills. He selected one folder, opened it. This gentleman is 53 years of age. He operates a trap line in the Colorado mountains. He's seeking a working partner more than a traditional wife. The clerk glanced up. He's quite explicit that he expects hard labor and offers no luxuries. The situation would be isolated, difficult, but he offers legal marriage, equal partnership, and according to the trading post master who forwards his letters, he's known as a man of his word. Margaret reached for the letter. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly. She read Caleb Stroud's words once, then again. I do not expect affection. I offer respect, fair treatment, and an equal voice in all decisions. Something in her chest loosened, just a fraction. Not hope exactly, but possibility. If I were to respond, she said carefully, what would the arrangement be? You'd correspond by letter. If you both agree to proceed, he'd send money for passage. You'd travel west to Colorado Territory to a town called Pine Hollow. You'd meet, and if both parties are still agreeable, you'd marry. If not, the clerk shrugged. You'd need resources to return east or to establish yourself elsewhere. I see. I should mention, the clerk added, that the mountain country is quite harsh. Some women find it overwhelming. Margaret thought of the boarding house, the dwindling money, the mending she took in for pennies, the way Sarah had looked at her, like furniture that needed to be removed. I'm stronger than I look, she said. The clerk smiled faintly. Would you like to write a response? Yes. He provided paper and pencil. Margaret sat at the small desk by the window, watching the street below where people hurried past in the cold, all of them with somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. She began to write. Mr. Stroud, my name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 45 years old, widowed 3 years, and currently residing in St. Louis. I read your letter with great interest, as I find myself seeking exactly the kind of practical arrangement you describe. I have no illusions about frontier life. My husband and I lived modestly, and I am accustomed to work. I can cook, clean, sew, preserve food, tend a garden, and manage a household with economy. I am in good health and have no dependencies or debts. You mention expecting no affection. I respect your honesty. I lost my husband to illness, and I do not seek to replace him. However, I do seek security, purpose, and partnership with someone who will honor his word. If you can offer those things, I can offer the same in return. I have $12 to my name. If you find my qualifications acceptable and can provide passage west, I will come to Pine Hollow prepared to fulfill my part of our agreement. Respectfully, Margaret Whitmore. She read it over, then folded it before doubt could paralyze her. The clerk took the letter, made additional notes in his ledger, and placed everything in a larger envelope addressed to the Pine Hollow trading post. We'll forward this with the next mail coach, he said. Response time depends on weather and routes, but typically 4 to 6 weeks. Margaret nodded, paid the small fee the clerk requested, and descended the stairs back into the cold afternoon. 6 weeks. By then, her money would be nearly gone. By then, she'd be facing choices that made mountains and strangers seem comfortable by comparison. She walked back to the boarding house through streets turning gray with approaching snow, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt possibility. Chapter 3. The Journey. The letter arrived in Pine Hollow on a Tuesday in January, brought by the mail coach that fought through snow-drifted passes to reach the mountain settlements. Caleb collected it from the trading post, along with his monthly supplies, and read it standing in the cold wind outside the building. I am 45 years old, widowed 3 years. He read the entire letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. The trading postmaster, a man named Horace Daniels, who'd run the post for 20 years, watched through the window with undisguised curiosity. When Caleb came back inside to settle his account, Horace couldn't help himself. Good news, I hope? Caleb just looked at him. Horace cleared his throat, made change for the supplies. Just making conversation. But that evening, sitting by his fire with the letter spread on the table before him, Caleb took out a fresh piece of paper and began to write. Mrs. Whitmore, Your letter arrived today. Your qualifications are more than acceptable. I am enclosing a bank draft for $60. 50 for passage west and 10 for necessities along the journey. The route is long and difficult, particularly in winter, but the stage lines run regular if weather permits. Travel to Denver, then take the mountain stage to Pine Hollow. Send word ahead of your arrival date when you board the mountain stage. I will meet you at the trading post. I want to be clear about what awaits you here. The cabin is small but sound. We are 2 hours by trail from town in good weather, longer in bad. Winter lasts 6 months. The work is constant and difficult. If you have any doubts, now is the time to voice them. If you still wish to proceed, I will honor every word of my original letter. You will have equal say in our partnership, equal share of all we have, and the full protection of my name. C. Stroud. He enclosed the bank draft, half of what he'd saved over the winter, money he'd planned to use for new traps and spring supplies. If she took the money and never came, well, that would tell him everything he needed to know about his judgment, but somehow he didn't think she would. I have $12 to my name. Anyone desperate enough to admit that to a stranger was either honest beyond measure or too broken to lie. Either way, she'd come. The journey took Margaret 3 weeks. 3 weeks of bone-rattling stagecoaches, cramped rail cars, and nights in way stations that made her boarding house room look palatial. 3 weeks of watching the landscape transform outside grimy windows, from the orderly settlements of the east to the vast emptiness of the plains to the mountains that rose like walls against the western sky. 3 weeks to question every decision that had brought her here. The other passengers changed as she traveled west. In St. Louis, they'd been businessmen and families, people traveling with purpose and means. By the time she reached Denver, they were prospectors, gamblers, women with hard eyes and harder laughs. People running towards something or away from something, but all of them running. She fit right in. The mountain stage left Denver on a Monday morning in late February. 6 passengers crammed into a coach built for 4, baggage piled on top, the driver cracking his whip over a team of 6 horses that looked as weary as Margaret felt. The woman next to her, paint-worn and sharp-featured, traveling to a mining camp to visit family in a tone that suggested no such thing, studied Margaret with frank curiosity. First time in the mountains? Yes. Headed to Pine Hollow? Yes. The woman's eyes narrowed with assessment. Got family there? Work? Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler. I'm meeting my husband. Didn't know you had one. The woman's tone made it clear she'd spotted the lack of a wedding ring. I will soon. Understanding flickered across the woman's face. Not judgment, just recognition. Mail-order bride. Well, good luck with that, honey. Mountain men are... She shrugged. Different. Different how? The woman considered. The mountains don't suffer fools or weaklings. Men who survive up there, they're either tough as iron or crazy as bedbugs. Sometimes both. She patted Margaret's hand with surprising kindness. Just remember, if he turns out wrong, you got 2 feet. Use 'em. Margaret nodded, but in her heart she knew. She had $12 left after buying supplies for the journey. Barely enough to survive a week, let alone fund a retreat east. She'd bet everything on a letter from a stranger. There was no going back. The stage reached Pine Hollow just after sunset on a Thursday, 3 days after leaving Denver. The town, if you could call it that, huddled in a valley between mountains that looked black against the dying light. Perhaps a dozen buildings, wood smoke rising from stone chimneys, the sound of a piano playing badly somewhere in the distance. The stage stopped in front of the trading post, and the driver climbed down, began unhitching the team with the weary efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Margaret descended on stiff legs, her whole body aching from days of travel. The cold hit her like a physical force, not the damp cold of St. Louis, but a dry, piercing cold that seemed to find every gap in her clothing. The other passengers scattered quickly, the painted woman toward a cabin at the edge of town, the prospectors toward what was probably a saloon. Margaret stood alone in the gathering darkness, her single bag at her feet, looking around with rising anxiety. The trading post door opened, spilling lamplight across the frozen ground. A man emerged, tall, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy coat, dark hair going gray at the temples, pulled back in a rough tail. A face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains. Hard planes, deep lines, a jaw covered in several days' worth of beard, and eyes. Blue eyes that studied her with the same careful assessment she'd used to evaluate a horse at market. He stopped a few feet away, removed his hat. "Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse, but not unkind. "Mr. Stroud." They stood looking at each other in the cold and fading light. Margaret was acutely aware of how she must appear, travel-worn, dusty, older than her years. The fear that had been building all day crystallized into certainty. He'd take one look at her and change his mind. But Caleb Stroud just nodded, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. "Journey was hard?" "Long," she allowed. "The mountain leg is hardest. You held up well." He picked up her bag without asking permission, testing its weight. "This everything?" "Yes." "Light packer? Good." He glanced at the trading post. "You eaten?" "Not since this morning." "Come inside. We'll get you fed before we ride up." "Ride up tonight?" "Storm's coming tomorrow. Best to get you settled before it hits." He must have seen something in her face, exhaustion or fear or both, because he added, "There's a room above the post if you need to rest first, but the cabin's warmer and the climb's easier in daylight." Margaret thought of the painted woman's advice. If he turns out wrong, you got 2 feet. But running required somewhere to run to. She had nowhere. "I'd rather get settled," she said. Something that might have been approval flickered in those blue eyes. "All right then." Inside the trading post, Horace Daniels and his wife Mary were just closing up. Mary took one look at Margaret and immediately began preparing food. Bread, cheese, dried meat, coffee that was hot and strong enough to strip paint. While Margaret ate, she became aware of conversations stopping, of eyes turning her way. The trading post was also the social center of Pine Hollow, and word traveled fast in small towns. The trapper from the mountain had finally brought down a woman. Mary Daniels, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, sat across from Margaret while Caleb settled accounts with her husband. "You're braver than I'd be," Mary said quietly. "Living up there in the wild." "I don't know about brave." Margaret wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, seeking its warmth. "Desperate, perhaps." Mary smiled. "Sometimes they're the same thing." She lowered her voice further. "Caleb Stroud's a good man. Silent as stone and twice as stubborn, but fair. He won't cheat you or hurt you. That's more than most women can say about their husbands." "How long has he been here?" 20 years near enough. Came after the war looking like he'd been through hell. Never talks about it. Keeps to himself up on that mountain, comes to town once a month for supplies, doesn't cause trouble." Mary hesitated. He won't be easy to live with. He's forgotten how to talk to people, I think. But he's steady, and these days steady counts for a lot." Margaret nodded, absorbing this. A man who'd survived 20 years alone in the mountains was either incredibly strong or incredibly damaged. Probably both. But then she was damaged too. Maybe that's all marriage was at their age. 2 broken people trying to survive together because survival alone had gotten too hard. Caleb returned, carrying supplies in a canvas pack. "Ready?" Margaret stood, her legs protesting. "Ready." Outside, 2 horses waited, a large roan gelding and a smaller bay mare. Caleb secured her bag to the mare's saddle, then turned to Margaret. "You ride?" "Not in 15 years." "It'll come back." He gave her a leg up, waited while she settled into the saddle, then handed her the reins. "Stay behind me. The trail's clear enough in moonlight, but it's steep. If you feel unsure, say so." "I will." He mounted his own horse with the ease of long practice, turned toward the trail that led up into the darkness. Margaret followed. The climb took 2 hours. 2 hours of navigating a narrow trail that switched back up the mountainside, the horses picking their way carefully over rocks and roots. 2 hours of cold air that burned her lungs and stars that blazed overhead with a brilliance she'd never seen in the city. 2 hours of silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the creak of leather. Caleb didn't speak, didn't turn to check on her, just led the way with the confidence of a man who'd ridden this trail 1,000 times in every kind of weather. Margaret focused on staying in the saddle, on following the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her, on not thinking about how high they were climbing or what waited at the top. The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from the darkness like something that had grown there, a solid structure of logs and stone tucked against the mountainside, smoke drifting from its chimney. Caleb dismounted, helped her down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, and his hand on her elbow was the only thing that kept her upright. "Inside," he said. "I'll tend the horses." She stumbled toward the door, pushed it open. Warmth hit her like a blessing. A fire burned in a large stone hearth that dominated one wall. The interior was a single room, perhaps 20 feet square, with a sleeping loft above. Rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bench, shelves lined with supplies, furs and hides hanging from the rafters. Everything was clean, orderly, functional. A trapline cabin, a survival cabin, a home. Margaret moved to the fire and sank onto the bench, holding her hands toward the flames. Her whole body was shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from the enormity of what she'd just done. She'd climbed a mountain to marry a stranger. The door opened and Caleb entered, bringing cold air and the smell of horses with him. He hung his coat on a peg, removed his boots, moved about the cabin with the economy of motion that came from living alone. He poured water from a bucket into a kettle, hung it over the fire, added coffee grounds. "You'll want to wash," he said, still not quite looking at her. "Water's heating. There's a basin in the loft, soap and towels. He gestured vaguely. "I'll stay down here." "Thank you." He nodded, moved to the window, stood looking out at the darkness. Margaret climbed the ladder to the loft, found it surprisingly spacious. A bed with a real mattress, furs piled for warmth, a small dresser, the basin and pitcher he'd mentioned. Everything spotlessly clean. She washed quickly in the heated water, changed into her one clean dress, braided her hair. When she descended the ladder, she found Caleb sitting at the table, the coffee ready, 2 cups waiting. He stood when she appeared, gestured to a chair. They sat across from each other like strangers at a business meeting, which, Margaret supposed, was exactly what they were. Caleb cleared his throat. "I should say, the sleeping arrangements. The loft is yours. I'll bed down here by the fire." "That doesn't seem fair. It's your cabin." "It's our cabin now." He said it simply, like a fact. "Marriage is tomorrow. We'll ride down at first light, see the preacher, file the paperwork. Then we come back up and—" He shrugged. "We figure out how to live together." "Just like that?" "You got a better plan?" Margaret almost laughed. Almost. No, I don't." They drank their coffee in silence. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the shutters. The storm Caleb had mentioned, arriving right on schedule. "The mountain respects no one," Caleb said suddenly. "Doesn't care if you're young or old, strong or weak, man or woman. It'll kill you just as quick either way." He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. "I need you to know that. This isn't going to be easy. It's going to be harder than anything you've done before. I understand." "Do you?" His voice was gentle but skeptical. "You've lived in a city, had neighbors, shops, help when you needed it. Up here, there's just us. If you break a leg, I'm your doctor. If I break a leg, you're mine. If we run out of food before spring, we starve. If the cabin burns, we freeze. It's that simple." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Stroud, I'm 45 years old. I've buried a husband, lost my home, and been made to understand by my own family that I'm a burden they can't wait to be rid of. I came here because I had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. You're right. I don't know what mountain life requires, but I know what desperation requires, and I know how to work until my hands bleed if that's what survival takes. So if you're trying to scare me into leaving, you're too late. I'm already here." Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, just once. "All right then." He stood, moved to a trunk in the corner, and withdrew a bundle of furs. "You'll need these. Nights get cold, even with the fire." "What about you?" "I've got enough." He gestured to the pile of blankets near the hearth. Margaret took the furs, climbed back to the loft. The bed was firm, the furs heavy and warm. Through the floorboards, she could hear Caleb moving around below, banking the fire, checking the door, settling in for the night. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the unfamiliar creaks of the cabin, and tried to comprehend what her life had become. Tomorrow she would marry a man whose first name she didn't even know. A man who'd spoken perhaps 100 words to her total. A man who lived on a mountain like a hermit and expected her to do the same. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something stranger, relief. Whatever else Caleb Stroud was, he was honest. He'd promised her shelter, protection, partnership. Not love, not comfort, not happiness, but survival. A chance to be something other than a burden. A place to belong, even if that place was the edge of the world. It was more than she'd had in St. Louis. Far below, in the valley, the town of Pine Hollow was settling in for the night. People in their warm homes, living their comfortable lives, never giving a thought to the woman who'd just climbed the mountain. But up here, in this cabin perched between earth and sky, Margaret Whitmore closed her eyes and slept better than she had in 3 years. Tomorrow she would become someone new. Tomorrow she would become a mountain wife. And if the mountain demanded everything she had to give, well, she'd give it. Because going back down was not an option. Not anymore. Not ever. The dawn came late to the mountains, filtered through clouds that promised the storm Caleb had predicted. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and frying meat, disoriented for a moment before memory crashed back. The journey, the climb, the cabin perched on the edge of the world. She dressed quickly in the cold air of the loft, her breath misting, and climbed down to find Caleb already moving through his morning routine with the precision of a man who'd lived alone too long to waste motion. "Storm will hit by afternoon," he said without preamble, flipping cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. "We leave in 20 minutes if we're going to beat it down the mountain." Margaret moved to the basin near the fire, splashed water on her face. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman who looked harder than she had yesterday, worn thin by travel and uncertainty. The wedding. Unless you changed your mind. She hadn't. Whatever doubts had plagued her during the night had burned away with the dawn. There was no other choice, no other path, only forward. "I haven't changed my mind." He nodded, dished food onto 2 tin plates. They ate quickly, standing by the fire, and Margaret noticed he'd already packed supplies, rope, a rifle, a heavy canvas coat that he handed to her without comment. "It's too big," she said, trying it on. "You'll grow into it." He pulled on his own coat, checked the loads in his rifle with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom weapons were tools, not threats. "The preacher's wife will have a dress you can borrow if you want. For the ceremony." Margaret looked down at her travel-worn dark blue wool, the best she owned. "This will do." Something shifted in his expression, approval, maybe, or relief that she wasn't the type to make a fuss about such things. "All right then, let's go." The ride down the mountain was faster than the climb up, but no less treacherous. The horses knew the trail, picking their way down switchbacks where one misstep would send them tumbling into the ravine below. Margaret focused on staying in the saddle, on trusting the mare beneath her, on not thinking about the drop that yawned to her left. Halfway down, the first snowflakes began to fall. "We'll make it," Caleb said, the first words he'd spoken since they left the cabin. "But it'll be close." They reached Pine Hollow as the snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes that obscured the mountains above and turned the little town into something from a faded photograph. Caleb led them directly to a small house behind the church, dismounted, and helped Margaret down. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, answered Caleb's knock with obvious surprise. "Caleb Stroud, didn't expect to see you till month's end." "Got business that won't wait," Caleb gestured to Margaret. "This is Margaret Whitmore. We need to be married." The preacher's eyebrows rose, but he recovered quickly. "I see. Well, come in out of the cold, both of you." Inside, the preacher's wife, a bustling woman named Ruth, took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing. Within minutes, she'd produced 2 witnesses from neighboring houses, set out the marriage register, and was pressing a small bouquet of dried flowers into Margaret's hands. "Every bride needs flowers," Ruth insisted, ignoring Margaret's protests. The ceremony itself took perhaps 10 minutes. Margaret stood beside a man she barely knew, repeating words that bound her life to his, aware of the witnesses watching with poorly concealed curiosity. When the preacher asked if she took Caleb Stroud as her lawfully wedded husband, She heard her own voice, steady, clear, say, "I do." Caleb's voice, when his turn came, was quieter, but equally certain. The preacher pronounced them married, and Caleb turned to her with an expression of mild confusion, as if unsure what came next. Margaret saved them both the awkwardness by extending her hand. He shook it, his grip warm and calloused, and something in his eyes might have been relief. They signed the register, Margaret Whitmore becoming Margaret Stroud with a few strokes of the pen, and Caleb paid the preacher's fee without haggling. Outside, the storm had intensified. Snow fell in sheets now, and the wind had picked up, howling down from the peaks. "We need to leave now," Caleb said, already moving toward the horses, "or we'll be trapped in town till it blows through." Ruth caught Margaret's arm. "You can stay here. Both of you. It's not safe to climb in this." But Caleb was already mounted, and Margaret understood without being told. The cabin was home now. The cabin was safety. Everything else was just the world they had to pass through to get back to where they belonged. She climbed onto the mare, gathered the reins. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Ruth." "You're a braver woman than I am," Ruth called over the wind. Margaret didn't feel brave. She felt terrified. But she turned the mare and followed Caleb anyway, back toward the trail that led up into the white fury of the storm. The climb was nightmare made manifest. The trail had already disappeared under several inches of snow, and more fell every moment, driven horizontal by wind that screamed like something alive and hungry. The horses struggled, their breath coming in great plumes of steam, their hooves slipping on ice hidden beneath the snow. Caleb rode ahead, never looking back, trusting her to follow or fall on her own. Margaret clung to the saddle, half blinded by snow, every muscle straining with the effort of staying mounted. Time lost meaning. There was only the next step, the next yard gained, the next moment of not falling into the white void that surrounded them. When the cabin finally materialized through the storm, Margaret wanted to weep with relief. Caleb, dismounted in a single fluid motion, was at her side before she could try to climb down on legs that had gone numb with cold. "I've got you." His hands on her waist were firm, lifting her down, keeping her upright when her knees buckled. "Get inside, I'll handle the horses." "I can help. Inside." It wasn't cruelty in his voice, just urgency. Margaret stumbled through the door into the cabin's warmth, her whole body shaking violently. She shed the oversized coat with clumsy fingers, moved to the fire that Caleb had banked before they left, began feeding it wood with hands that barely worked. He came in minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, bringing a blast of cold air. He'd covered the horses in the small lean-to stable on the cabin's north side, protected from the worst of the wind. "You all right?" he asked, moving to check the fire she'd built. "Just cold." He grunted, added more wood, adjusted the logs with practiced efficiency. "Could have been worse. Storm hit faster than I expected." He glanced at her, and for the first time since they'd met, something like concern crossed his face. "Your fingers. Let me see them." She held out her hands. They were white, bloodless, the tips starting to take on the waxy appearance of frostbite. "Damn." He grabbed her hands, not gently, but not roughly either, and began working them between his own, generating friction and heat. "Why didn't you say something?" "I didn't want to slow us down." "Slowing down is better than losing fingers." He pulled her closer to the fire, continued working her hands. "You feel any tingling?" "Starting to." "Good. That's good. Means the blood's coming back." He kept at it for several minutes, his large, rough hands engulfing hers, working warmth back into frozen flesh. When color finally began to return to her fingertips, he released her and moved to the stove. "You need hot food. Soup's in the pot, just needs heating." Margaret watched him work, this stranger who was now her husband, and tried to process the surreal nature of the last 24 hours. Yesterday she'd been alone in the world. Today she was married to a mountain man who'd just saved her from frostbite without making her feel foolish for earning it. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from the stove, surprised. "For what?" "For—" She gestured vaguely. "All of it." Caleb studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "We're partners now. That's what partners do." They ate soup and bread while the storm raged outside, the cabin creaking under the assault of wind and snow. When the meal was finished, Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the white darkness. "Storm will last 2, maybe 3 days," he said. "Good time for you to learn the cabin routines. Can't teach you the mountain till the weather clears, but you can learn how things work here." And so began Margaret's education in survival. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, if not a talkative one. He showed her how to manage the fire, how to bank it at night so it would last till morning, how to tell by the color of the flames if it was burning efficiently, where he kept the kindling dry. He taught her his system for storing food, the root vegetables in the cool cellar beneath the floor, the dried meat hanging from rafters, the precious coffee and sugar in sealed tins to keep out moisture and mice. "Everything has its place," he explained, showing her the careful organization that kept supplies from being wasted or lost. "Up here, you can't just run to a shop if you need something. What you have is what you have till the next supply run." Margaret absorbed it all, asked questions, made mental notes. The cabin was small but remarkably well designed for mountain life. The thick log walls kept out the worst of the cold. The stone fireplace provided heat and cooking space. The loft was positioned to capture rising warmth. Every detail had been thought through by someone who understood that the difference between comfort and death was often just a matter of inches. On the second day of the storm, Caleb began teaching her the practical skills she'd need. How to bake bread in the Dutch oven over the fire. How to melt snow for water without wasting fuel. How to sharpen a knife properly. How to load and fire his spare rifle. "I don't know if I could shoot anything," Margaret said, holding the heavy weapon awkwardly. "Not asking you to hunt. But if a wolf comes sniffing around while I'm on the trap line, you need to be able to scare it off." He adjusted her grip on the rifle. "Stock against your shoulder, firm but not tight. Look down the barrel, line up the sights, squeeze the trigger. Don't pull." The rifle kicked when she fired it, bruising her shoulder even through her layers of clothing. The shot went wide of the target Caleb had set up, but he nodded approval. "You'll get better. Practice twice a week till it feels natural." That night, after a supper of venison stew and cornbread, they sat by the fire and Caleb pulled out a worn ledger. "Need to show you the accounting," he said. "You should know exactly what we have, what we owe, what we can afford." He went through the numbers methodically, what furs brought at the trading post, what supplies cost, how much they needed to set aside for taxes and emergencies. Margaret was surprised by how carefully he managed his money, how he tracked every penny. "You're a better bookkeeper than my late husband ever was," she said. Caleb's hand paused on the page. "What was he like?" "Your husband." It was the first personal question he'd asked. Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Kind, steady. We were comfortable together." She smiled slightly. "He talked more than you do." "Most people do. It doesn't bother me. The quiet." She looked around the cabin, at the warm firelight playing on log walls, at the snow swirling beyond the window. "It's peaceful, in its way." "Peaceful." Caleb tested the word like it was foreign. "Never thought of it that way. Lonely, sometimes. But peaceful. Yeah, I suppose it is." They fell into silence again, but it was different now. Less the silence of strangers, more the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Margaret woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through the cabin windows. The world outside transformed into a landscape of white curves and blue shadows. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls, nearly reaching the bottom of the windows. Caleb was already up, dressed in heavy furs, checking supplies. "Need to dig out," he said when he saw her descending the ladder. "Then I'll show you the real work." They spent the morning shoveling snow away from the cabin and the stable, clearing paths to the woodpile and the root cellar entrance. Margaret's muscles screamed in protest. She'd thought herself strong enough, but this was labor of a different order than anything she'd known. By noon, her back ached and her hands were blistered despite the gloves Caleb had given her. But she didn't complain. She just kept shoveling. "You're tougher than you look," Caleb said, taking the shovel from her when he noticed her hands shaking. "But you need to pace yourself. Mountain's not a race, it's a marathon that never ends." "How do you do it?" Margaret asked, watching him work with seemingly endless stamina. "Day after day, year after year? You get used to it, or you break." He glanced at her. "You won't break." "How can you tell?" "Because you're still standing." Over the following weeks, as winter began its slow retreat and the days grew incrementally longer, Margaret learned the rhythms of mountain life. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky at dawn, to tell by the wind's direction if a storm was coming from the peaks or the valley. She learned which plants poking through the melting snow were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you if you made the mistake of eating them. Caleb took her on short trips into the forest, teaching her to recognize landmarks, to navigate by the sun and stars, to understand the mountain's geography so she wouldn't get lost. "If something happens to me," he said one afternoon as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, "you need to be able to get to town on your own. Nothing's going to happen to you. Mountain doesn't care about our plans." He pointed to different landmarks, making her repeat their names and positions until she had them memorized. "That peak with the split top, that's north. The trading post is due east. If you follow the creek down, it'll take you to Pine Hollow. Takes about 4 hours on foot if you're moving steady." Margaret committed it all to memory, understanding the practical necessity, even as something in her chest tightened at the thought of having to make that journey alone. But she was learning. Every day she was learning. She learned to chop wood without exhausting herself, to stack it so it would dry properly. She learned to hang washing on lines strung between trees, to time it so the clothes would dry before the mountain cold froze them solid. She learned to cook on the temperamental stove, to judge heat by holding her hand above the surface, to make bread that rose properly even at altitude. And slowly, hesitantly, she and Caleb learned to live together. It wasn't easy. 20 years of solitude had made him set in his ways, comfortable with his own routines. He liked his coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. He preferred silence in the mornings. He went to bed early and rose before dawn, moving through the cabin like a ghost while Margaret was still struggling toward consciousness. But he was also fair. He divided chores evenly, never asking her to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When she struggled with tasks that required strength she didn't yet have, he helped without making her feel inadequate. When she succeeded at something difficult, he acknowledged it with a nod or a quiet, "good work," that felt more valuable than effusive praise. And he kept his word about equal partnership. When decisions needed to be made, whether to buy more chickens in spring, how to spend their limited cash, what repairs the cabin needed, he asked her opinion and genuinely listened to her answers. "You've got a good head for this," he said one evening as they planned their spring garden. "Better than mine, maybe. I just plant things and hope they grow. You actually think about it." "My mother taught me," Margaret said, sketching a rough layout on a piece of paper. "She said a good garden is like a good household, everything in its proper place, everything serving a purpose." Smart woman. She was. Margaret looked up from her drawing. "What about your family? You never mentioned them." Caleb's expression closed off, the way it always did when anything personal came up. "They're gone. Long time ago." "I'm sorry." He shrugged, standing to add wood to the fire. "Life keeps moving forward, whether we want it to or not." It was the most he'd said about his past, and Margaret knew better than to push. They all had ghosts, some you talked about, some you didn't. The first real test of their partnership came in late March, when the snow had melted enough for Caleb to check his trap lines. He left before dawn, explaining that he'd be gone most of the day, possibly into evening if he needed to reset traps or track wounded game. "You'll be all right here?" he asked, and Margaret heard the uncertainty beneath the question. He'd been alone for 20 years. Trusting someone else to manage while he was gone didn't come naturally. "I'll be fine. I know the routine. Fire needs feeding every 2 hours. Keep the rifle loaded. Don't go wandering off." "I won't." He hesitated in the doorway, clearly torn between necessity and worry. "If anything happens, nothing will happen. Go check your traps." He left, and Margaret stood in the suddenly quiet cabin, aware that this was her first time truly alone on the mountain, not alone in a boarding house with thin walls and neighbors, not alone in a town with shops and churches and people. Alone in a way that city dwellers never understood. No one for miles, no help available, nothing but her own competence between survival and disaster. She took a deep breath and got to work. The day passed in a blur of activity. She tended the fire, prepared food, washed clothes in water she'd hauled from the creek, She checked the chickens Caleb had acquired the previous week, collected eggs, scattered grain. She mended a tear in one of Caleb's shirts, then started on her own dress that had caught on a branch during their last walk. Afternoon faded into evening. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and still Caleb hadn't returned. Margaret tried not to worry. He'd said he might be late. But as true darkness fell and the temperature dropped, anxiety began to gnaw at her. The mountain was dangerous. A twisted ankle, a fall, a surprise encounter with a bear or mountain lion. Any of those could leave him stranded, injured, dying in the cold. She kept the fire bright, a beacon in case he was trying to find his way back in the darkness. She heated soup, kept it warm, checked the door every few minutes, even though she knew he wouldn't arrive any faster because she was watching. The moon had risen before she finally heard it, the sound of a horse approaching, hooves careful on the rocky trail. Caleb came through the door carrying 2 rabbits and a beaver pelt, his face exhausted but satisfied. He stopped when he saw the bright fire, the warm food waiting, Margaret standing with obvious relief written across her features. "Thought you might worry," he said. "I did. A little." He hung up the game, shed his coat. "Traps needed more work than I expected. Found a beaver dam that's been flooding the creek. Need to deal with that soon or it'll wash out the trail." "Are you hurt?" "Just tired." He moved to the fire, accepted the bowl of soup she handed him. "You did good today. Cabin looks better than when I left it." It was such a small compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, but Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest anyway. She'd proven herself capable. She'd managed alone. She was becoming the partner he needed. "Thank you," she said. They ate in comfortable silence, and later, when Caleb climbed into his bedroll by the fire and Margaret ascended to the loft, something had shifted between them. Not romance, they were too practical for that, too worn by life to believe in fairy tales. But trust, respect, the beginning of something that might, in time, become friendship. April brought warmer weather and new challenges. The snowmelt swelled the creek into a torrent, making water collection easier but laundry dangerous. One misstep on the slick rocks could send you tumbling into currents strong enough to break bones. Margaret learned to be careful, to test each step, to respect the water's power. They planted the garden together, Caleb breaking the earth with practiced efficiency, while Margaret followed behind, setting seeds at proper intervals, covering them with soil mixed with last year's compost. Their hands worked in rhythm, not speaking but coordinated. Like partners in a dance they were still learning. One evening, as they sat on the bench outside the cabin watching the sun paint the peaks gold and crimson, Caleb spoke unexpectedly. "You settling in all right? Really?" Margaret considered the question. A month ago, she'd been desperate and alone in St. Louis, facing a future that terrified her. Now she was on a mountain, married to a near stranger, working harder than she'd ever worked in her life. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I am." "It gets easier. Your body adapts. Summer's actually pleasant up here. Cool when the valley's baking. And once you've survived a full year, you know you can do it again." "Is that what you did? Just survived year after year?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Surviving was enough. For a long time it was all I could manage." He glanced at her. "But having a partner, it makes things different. Better, maybe." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that their arrangement had become more than just practical necessity. Margaret felt something warm and fragile unfurl in her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. "For me too," she said softly. The sun sank below the peaks, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, 2 people who'd been strangers learning to be something more. The real test came 3 weeks later, when spring's deceptive warmth gave way to a late-season blizzard that screamed down from the peaks without warning. They'd gone to bed with clear skies. Margaret woke before dawn to wind that shook the cabin walls and cold so intense it had penetrated even the thick furs piled on her bed. She descended the ladder to find Caleb already up, checking the fire with a grim expression. "Late spring storm," he said. "Worst kind. Comes fast, hits hard. We're going to need to bring the horses into the cabin." "Into the cabin?" "Lean-to won't hold in wind like this. We lose the horses, we're trapped till summer. They worked together in the screaming darkness, fighting wind that tried to knock them off their feet, leading the terrified horses into the cabin's main room. It was crowded chaos, two large animals stamping and snorting, hay scattered everywhere, the temperature dropping despite the roaring fire. But they were all alive, all together, all surviving. The storm lasted 36 hours. Margaret and Caleb took shifts keeping the fire fed, calming the horses, melting snow for water. They huddled together by necessity, sharing body heat when the cold became too intense to bear separately. On the second night, when the wind was at its worst and the cabin walls groaned under the assault, Margaret felt Caleb's hand find hers in the darkness. "You scared?" he asked. She was terrified, but she was also exhilarated in a strange way, alive in a manner she'd never felt in her safe, comfortable old life. "A little," she admitted, "but I trust this cabin. I trust you." His hand tightened around hers. "I trust you too." They sat like that through the worst of the storm, hands clasped, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. When dawn finally came and the wind began to die, they were still there. Two people who'd become partners in the truest sense. When they finally led the horses back outside and surveyed the damage, broken branches, drifted snow, part of the lean-to roof torn away, Caleb turned to Margaret with something like wonder in his eyes. "You didn't panic, didn't complain, just did what needed doing. So did you. I've been doing this for 20 years. And now," Margaret said, meeting his gaze steadily, "you don't have to do it alone." Something shifted in his expression, walls coming down, armor cracking. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less worn. "No," he agreed. "I don't." The smile faded from Caleb's face within moments, as if he'd remembered something he'd forgotten how to do and wasn't sure he should have tried. But something had changed between them during that storm, something neither of them could name but both recognized. In the weeks that followed, their partnership deepened into something more comfortable, more natural. They developed a rhythm, moving around each other in the small cabin with the ease of people who knew each other's habits, finishing each other's tasks without needing to be asked. May brought the true thaw, the mountain transforming from white desolation into an explosion of green and wildflowers. Margaret discovered she loved this season best, the creek running full and clear, the meadows carpeted in columbine and lupine, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. She'd grown stronger over the winter months, her body adapting to the altitude and the constant physical demands. Her hands were calloused now, her shoulders broader, her stride more confident on the rocky trails. She was becoming a mountain woman, and the realization filled her with quiet pride. One morning in late May, as they worked together repairing the lean-to roof that the spring storm had damaged, Caleb paused in his hammering and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, holding a board steady while he nailed it into place. "You look different than when you arrived." "I'm wearing the same dress." "Not that. You look settled, like you belong here." He drove another nail home with 3 precise strikes. "I wasn't sure you would. Belong, I mean." "Neither was I," Margaret admitted, "but I do." They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, the sound of hammering echoing across the valley. When they finished and stood back to admire their work, Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead and made a decision. "Need to make the monthly supply run tomorrow. Thought you might want to come along. See some faces besides mine." Margaret had been down to Pine Hollow only once since their wedding, a brief trip in March to sell furs and buy essential supplies. The town had felt strange after months on the mountain, too crowded, too noisy, the air too thick and warm. She'd been almost relieved to climb back up to the cabin, but there were things they needed, and perhaps seeing Mary Daniels and Ruth again would be pleasant. "All right," she said, "I'll come." They set out before dawn the next morning, the horses picking their way down the familiar trail as the sun rose behind them, painting the peaks gold and rose. It was a beautiful ride, and Margaret found herself enjoying it in a way she hadn't before. No longer terrified of falling, no longer overwhelmed by the wilderness. She was part of it now. They reached Pine Hollow just before noon, the town bustling with activity. Spring brought miners and prospectors up from the valleys, traders passing through on their way to settlements farther west, farmers from the surrounding area coming in for supplies. The trading post was crowded, and Margaret noticed the way people's eyes followed them, the mountain hermit and his mail-order bride, still objects of curiosity and speculation. Mary Daniels greeted them warmly, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret. "Look at you!" Mary exclaimed, coming around the counter to clasp Margaret's hands. "You've survived the winter. I had my doubts, I'll admit it, but you look positively thriving." "The mountain's been kind to us," Margaret said. "The mountain or the man?" Mary asked with a knowing smile, glancing at Caleb, who was already deep in conversation with Horace about fur prices and summer supplies. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Both, I suppose." While Caleb conducted business, Margaret browsed the store's limited selection of goods, mentally calculating what they could afford against what they needed. She was examining a bolt of sturdy cotton fabric. Her dresses were wearing thin and would need replacing soon, when a stranger approached. He was well dressed for Pine Hollow, wearing a suit that had seen better days but was still finer than anything the locals wore. His face was narrow, sharp-featured, with eyes that assessed her with uncomfortable intensity. "Mrs. Stroud?" he asked, removing his hat. Margaret's instinct was to deny it, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes?" "I wonder if I might have a word with you. My name is James Garrett. I've come from St. Louis on a matter of some urgency." Every muscle in Margaret's body went rigid. Nothing good ever came from St. Louis. Nothing good ever came from well-dressed strangers appearing in frontier towns asking questions. "I'm rather busy at the moment," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It concerns your late husband's business affairs. There's been some confusion about certain financial matters." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding, but my employer would very much like to speak with you about some missing funds." The fabric fell from Margaret's hands. Missing funds. The words hit her like a physical blow, bringing memories she'd tried to bury rushing back to the surface. Thomas's death hadn't just been sudden. It had been complicated. In his final months, he'd been working on the railroad's accounting, conducting some kind of audit. He'd come home pale and agitated, talking about discrepancies, about money that didn't add up. He'd mentioned a name, Thornton. Gerald Thornton, a businessman with interests in several railroad companies. Then Thomas had gotten sick and died, and Margaret had been too consumed with grief and survival to think much about his final projects. Until now. "I don't know anything about missing funds," she said firmly. "My husband died 3 years ago. I had nothing to do with his business affairs." Of course, Garrett's tone was soothing, but his eyes remained cold. "Nevertheless, Mr. Thornton is quite insistent. He's prepared to pursue this matter through legal channels if necessary. However, if you were willing to speak with him, perhaps in Denver, I'm sure we could resolve this like civilized people." Margaret became aware that the conversation in the trading post had stopped, that people were watching. She also became aware of Caleb, who had moved to her side with the silent efficiency of a predator. "My wife said she doesn't know anything about it," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge Margaret had never heard before. "That should be the end of your conversation." Garrett's expression hardened. "And you are?" "Her husband. The one standing right here, which you should have noticed before you started making accusations." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm simply trying to conduct business." "Your business is done." Caleb stepped forward slightly, not threatening exactly, but making his presence felt. "We don't have time for whatever scam you're running." "I assure you, sir, this is no scam. Mr. Thornton has evidence that suggests Mrs. Stroud, or rather Mrs. Whitmore, as she was known then, may have taken money from her late husband's accounts before his death." The lie was so blatant, so perfectly calculated to cause maximum damage, that Margaret actually gasped. "That's not true. I never—" "Save it for the sheriff," Caleb cut her off. "You got proof of these accusations? Mr. Thornton has documentation. Then he can send it to the territorial marshal and file proper charges. Till then, you can get out of my sight before I throw you out." Garrett's lips pressed into a thin line. He reached into his coat. Caleb's hand went to his knife and produced a folded document. I took the liberty of obtaining a warrant for questioning, Garrett said, handing it to Caleb. It's all quite legal, I assure you. Caleb unfolded the paper, his face darkening as he read. Margaret felt her world tilting, the solid ground of her new life suddenly uncertain beneath her feet. This is signed by a judge in Denver, Caleb said slowly. Indeed, Mrs. Stroud is requested to appear for questioning regarding the alleged theft of $2,000 from the First Bank of St. Louis. $2,000. The sum was staggering. Thomas hadn't earned $2,000 in 5 years of work, much less had that much to steal. Margaret found her voice, though it shook. This is a lie. My husband never had access to that kind of money. When he died, I had barely enough to bury him. Nevertheless, bank records suggest otherwise. Garrett tucked the warrant away. You have 1 week to present yourself in Denver, Mrs. Stroud. Failure to comply will result in a warrant for your arrest. He replaced his hat, nodded to the watching crowd, and walked out of the trading post. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood frozen, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. She could hear the whispers starting already, see the suspicion forming on familiar faces. The mountain hermit's mail-order bride was a thief. She'd stolen money and run west to hide. That's why she'd been so desperate to marry a stranger and disappear into the wilderness. The story wrote itself, perfect and poisonous. We're leaving, Caleb said quietly. Now. He gathered their supplies with swift efficiency, threw money on the counter without counting it, and guided Margaret toward the door with a hand on her elbow. She moved like a sleepwalker, barely aware of her surroundings, her mind racing with panic and disbelief. They were almost out the door when Horace called after them. Caleb, wait. Caleb stopped, turned. Horace approached, his expression troubled. I don't know what that was about, but I know you, and I've gotten to know your wife these past months. Whatever that man said, I don't believe it. Doesn't matter what you believe, Caleb said roughly. He's got a warrant. A warrant from Denver based on what? The word of some businessman from back east? That's not justice, that's harassment. Horace glanced at Margaret. I knew your late husband was a railroad clerk, ma'am. Did he ever have dealings with this Thornton fellow? Margaret's mind felt sluggish, but she forced herself to think. Thomas was conducting an audit in his final months. He found discrepancies. He mentioned Thornton's name, said something was wrong with the accounts. Understanding dawned on Horace's face. So Thornton's got something to hide, and now he's trying to discredit anyone who might expose him. We can't prove that, Margaret whispered. No, but it makes more sense than you stealing money you never had access to. Horace looked at Caleb. You need a lawyer, someone who knows territorial law. Can't afford a lawyer. There's a man in Denver, Samuel Beckett. He's honest, and he doesn't charge if he doesn't think you have a case. At least talk to him before you do anything else. Caleb nodded slowly. Appreciate it, Horace. They left the trading post and rode out of town in silence, the supplies packed hastily on the horses. Margaret was acutely aware of the stares following them, of the damage that had been done in just 10 minutes. By nightfall, everyone in Pine Hollow would know. By next week, the story would have spread to every settlement within 100 miles. The ride up the mountain passed in a blur. When they finally reached the cabin, Caleb helped her dismount and then just stood there, holding the reins of both horses, staring at the ground. I'm sorry, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I should have told you about Thomas's work. I should have realized this might come back. Stop. Caleb looked up at her, his expression fierce. This isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But the warrant is based on lies. He led the horses toward the lean-to with angry, jerky movements. Some rich man back east is trying to cover his own crimes by framing a widow who had the bad luck to marry a man who discovered his corruption. You don't know that for certain. I know you. He began unsaddling the horses with rough efficiency. I've lived with you for 4 months, watched you work yourself to exhaustion, learning how to survive up here. Seen you face down blizzards and wolves and cold that would break most people. You're a lot of things, Margaret, but you're not a thief. The use of her given name stopped her. He'd never used it before, always called her Mrs. Stroud or just you. The intimacy of it, combined with the fierce certainty in his voice, made her throat tight with emotion. What if they don't believe that? What if the warrant is enough to convict me? Caleb finished with the horses, turned to face her fully. Then we fight it. We go to Denver. We talk to this lawyer. We make them prove their accusations. And if that doesn't work, he paused. Then we disappear. Head west to California or north to Montana. Start over somewhere they can't find us. You do that? Abandon your land, your cabin, everything you've built here? I've told you before. We're partners now. That means I stand with you, whatever comes. His jaw set stubbornly. I spent 20 years alone on this mountain running from ghosts. I'm not going to lose what we've built together because some corrupt businessman wants to silence the truth about your husband's death. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. For the first time since Thomas died, she wasn't alone. She had someone willing to fight for her, to risk everything to protect her. I don't deserve this, she whispered. I don't deserve you. Deserve's got nothing to do with it. Caleb crossed the distance between them, hesitated, then pulled her into an awkward embrace. We're married. That means something up here. It means something to me. Margaret buried her face against his chest and let herself cry for the first time since the confrontation in the trading post. Caleb held her stiffly at first, clearly uncomfortable with the display of emotion, but gradually his arms tightened around her, offering comfort in the only way he knew how, through solid, steady presence. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, the sun was setting behind the western peaks. We should go inside, Caleb said quietly. Talk about this properly. They built up the fire and sat at the table with the warrant spread between them. Caleb read it thoroughly, his finger tracing each line. It's vague, he said finally. Doesn't cite specific evidence, just allegations. That works in our favor. If they had real proof, they'd be more specific. So what do? We go to Denver, talk to this lawyer Horace mentioned, find out what our options are. He looked up at her. But we do it together. I'm not letting you face this alone. The trap line can wait. This is more important. They spent the evening planning, discussing possibilities, preparing for the journey to Denver. As the night deepened and they finally banked the fire for sleep, Margaret climbed to the loft feeling both terrified and oddly hopeful. She'd faced worse odds before, the mountain had taught her that much. And now she had something she'd never had in St. Louis. She had a partner. They left for Denver 2 days later, having prepared the cabin for their absence and asked Horace to check on their property while they were gone. The ride down out of the mountains felt like descending from one world into another, from the clean, honest wilderness where survival was the only law, into the complicated realm of human justice where truth was often less important than power and money. Denver sprawled across the plains where the mountains met the prairie, a city growing too fast to be contained by reason or planning. Buildings rose haphazardly, streets teemed with wagons and horses and people rushing in all directions. The noise after months of mountain silence was overwhelming. Samuel Beckett's office occupied a second-floor walk-up above a general store. The lawyer himself was a surprisingly young man, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained energy. Horace Daniels sent word you'd be coming, Beckett said, gesturing them to chairs in his cluttered office. Tell me everything. Margaret recounted the story. Thomas's work, his sudden illness and death, her years of poverty afterward, her marriage to Caleb, and move west. Beckett listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When she finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. Gerald Thornton, he said thoughtfully. I know the name. He's got railroad interests, mining operations, a finger in every profitable pie west of the Mississippi. He's also ruthless and connected to some very powerful people. Can we fight him? Caleb asked bluntly. The question is whether we should. Fighting costs money I suspect you don't have. And even if we win in court, Thornton could make your lives miserable in other ways. He has influence. So we should just give up? Margaret's voice was sharper than she intended. I didn't say that. Beckett leaned forward. I said fighting costs money, but there might be another way. He tapped his fingers on the desk. Your husband found discrepancies in the railroad accounts. Did he keep records, notes, anything that might document what he discovered? Margaret's heart sank. If he did, they'd have been in our house. I sold everything when he died. I have nothing. Nothing at all? No personal effects? No papers? She started to shake her head, then stopped. Wait. There was a box. Small, locked. Thomas kept it in his desk. I couldn't find the key, and I was so overwhelmed with the funeral and selling the house that I brought it with me. I barely remember packing it. Where is it now? At the cabin. In the loft, with my other things. Beckett stood abruptly. Then that's where we need to go. If your husband documented what he found, and if those documents implicate Thornton in fraud or embezzlement, then suddenly this case looks very different. Instead of defending you against theft charges, we're talking about you as a witness in a much larger case. That would make her even more of a target, Caleb said, his face grim. True, but it would also make her harder to silence. Right now she's just a widow nobody cares about. But if she has evidence that could bring down a powerful man, that changes everything. Thornton can't just make her disappear, not without raising the exact kind of questions he's trying to avoid. Margaret's mind was racing. The box. I haven't thought about it in years. I don't even know if there's anything important in it. Only one way to find out. Beckett grabbed his coat. How fast can we get to your cabin? 2 days hard riding, Caleb said. Maybe a day and a half if we don't stop much. Then let's not waste time. The journey back to the cabin was punishing. Long hours in the saddle, brief stops to rest the horses, sleeping on the hard ground. Beckett proved to be a surprisingly capable rider and didn't complain about the conditions, though Margaret saw him wincing as they climbed into the higher elevations. They reached the cabin late on the second day, exhausted and saddle-sore. While Caleb tended the horses and Beckett examined the cabin with the interest of someone who'd never seen frontier living up close, Margaret climbed to the loft and found the box exactly where she'd left it, shoved in the back corner of the small dresser, covered with spare blankets. It was an ordinary box, dark wood with simple brass fittings, about the size of a large book. The lock was small but sturdy. Found it, she called down. Caleb came up the ladder, carrying a small tool from his kit. Let me try. It took him only a few minutes to pick the lock, a skill he'd learned during the war, he explained without elaborating. The small brass clasp clicked open, and Margaret lifted the lid with trembling hands. Inside were papers. Dozens of pages covered in Thomas's careful handwriting, ledger sheets with columns of numbers, notes scribbled in margins. And at the bottom, a letter addressed to the territorial marshal that Thomas had apparently written, but never sent. Margaret lifted the letter with shaking hands and began to read aloud. To the Honorable Marshal of Colorado Territory, I write to report serious financial irregularities I have discovered in my capacity as clerk for the Union Railroad Company. Over the past 6 months, I have documented systematic embezzlement of company funds totaling in excess of $50,000. The scheme involves falsified invoices, ghost employees, and the manipulation of construction contracts. The evidence I have gathered implicates Mr. Gerald Thornton, who serves on the railroad's board of directors, as the primary architect of this fraud. Margaret's voice caught. Thomas had known. He'd known exactly what Thornton was doing and had documented it all. Beckett took the letter, read through it quickly, then began sorting through the other papers. His expression grew more animated with each page. This is extraordinary, he said. Your husband was meticulous. He's documented dates, amounts, bank transfers. He's got copies of falsified invoices with notes showing the real costs versus what was claimed. He even has the names of witnesses, other railroad employees who could testify. He looked up at Margaret with something like awe. This isn't just evidence. This is a complete case ready to prosecute. Then why didn't he? Margaret asked. Why didn't he send the letter or go to the authorities? Because he got sick, Caleb said quietly, and died before he could. Or because Thornton found out and made sure he got sick, Beckett said grimly. Pneumonia is easy to mistake for other things, and there are poisons that mimic natural illness. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt her stomach turn. You think Thornton killed Thomas? I think it's a strong possibility. And I think when Thornton discovered that Thomas had a wife, he initially assumed she knew nothing and would be too grief-stricken to investigate. But then you disappeared west, and that made him nervous. So he's trying to discredit you preemptively, in case you ever did have evidence or knowledge that could hurt him. Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Thomas hadn't just died of bad luck or cruel fate. He'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing, and she'd been too consumed with her own survival to even realize it. "What do we do with this?" she asked. Beckett carefully gathered the papers, his face set with determination. "We take this to the territorial marshal. We file a formal complaint against Thornton for embezzlement and fraud, and we make sure everyone knows that you're the one who provided the evidence, which means if anything happens to you, it will look extremely suspicious." "That makes her bait," Caleb objected. "It also makes her safe. Right now she's vulnerable because nobody knows she exists. Once this becomes public, she's protected by visibility." Beckett looked at Margaret. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be unpleasant. Thornton will fight back. He'll try to destroy your reputation, claim the evidence is forged, throw everything he has at discrediting you. But if you're willing to stand up in court and testify about your husband's work, we can bring him down." Margaret thought about Thomas, kind, steady Thomas, who'd tried to do the right thing and died for it. She thought about the weeks she'd spent on the edge of starvation in St. Louis, pushed aside and forgotten. She thought about climbing a mountain to marry a stranger because it was the only choice she had left. And she thought about the life she was building now, the partnership she'd found, the strength she'd discovered in herself. "I'll testify," she said firmly. "Thomas deserves justice, and I deserve to stop running from other people's crimes." Caleb moved to stand beside her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Then we do this together." Beckett nodded, a fierce smile crossing his face. "Good, because gentlemen like Gerald Thornton have gotten away with far too much for far too long. It's time someone stood up to them." They spent the night at the cabin, Beckett sleeping in Caleb's usual spot by the fire, while Caleb climbed to the loft for the first time since Margaret had arrived. They lay in the darkness on opposite sides of the bed, careful not to touch, the tension between them awkward but not unwelcome. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said quietly. "We could still run. Take the evidence to the newspapers instead of the courts. Let them fight it without putting yourself in the crossfire." "I have to," Margaret replied. "For Thomas, for myself, to prove that I'm not just some desperate widow who can be pushed around and silenced. You've already proven that, every day on this mountain." "Maybe, but the world beyond this mountain doesn't know that. They see what Thornton wants them to see, a poor, powerless woman making accusations she can't back up." She turned her head to look at him in the darkness. "I need to show them the truth, even if it's dangerous." Caleb was silent for a long moment, then, "All right, but we do it smart. We do it safe. And at the first sign that Thornton's going to hurt you, we're gone. I don't care about justice if it means losing you." The words settled between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Margaret reached across the space that separated them and found his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing with me." His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and steady. Always. They left for Denver again at dawn, Beckett riding ahead while Caleb and Margaret followed at a more measured pace. The descent from the mountain felt different this time, not a retreat, but a march toward battle. Margaret was no longer running from her past. She was confronting it head-on, armed with truth and backed by a partner who wouldn't abandon her. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall. The mountain had taught her how to survive. Now it was time to teach her how to fight. They reached Denver in the late afternoon, the city bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. Beckett led them directly to the territorial marshal's office, a squat brick building that radiated official authority. Inside, they were kept waiting for nearly an hour while clerks shuffled papers and pretended not to stare at the mountain man and his wife, who'd brought a lawyer to make accusations against one of the territory's wealthiest citizens. The territorial marshal, when they finally met him, was a weathered man named Jacob Morrison, who looked like he'd spent more years enforcing law than breaking it. He listened to their story without interrupting, examined the documents Thomas had compiled, and read through the undelivered letter with an expression that grew progressively darker. "This is serious," Morrison said finally, setting the papers down with deliberate care. "If even half of what's documented here is accurate, we're talking about one of the largest embezzlement schemes I've seen. But you understand what you're asking me to do? Gerald Thornton has friends in very high places. The governor himself has attended dinners at Thornton's house." "Does that mean the law doesn't apply to him?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Morrison's eyes met hers with something like respect. No, ma'am. It means prosecuting him will be difficult and dangerous, for all of us. My husband died trying to expose this, Margaret said. I won't let his death mean nothing. Fair enough. Morrison stood, began pacing. Here's what I can do. I'll open an official investigation based on these documents. I'll question the witnesses your husband named, assuming they're still alive and willing to talk. I'll subpoena bank records and railroad accounts, but Mrs. Stroud, you need to understand, the moment I file this paperwork, Thornton will know, and he will come after you with everything he has. Let him try, Caleb said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Morrison pause and reassess the scarred mountain man sitting across from him. I'll also need you to stay in Denver, Morrison continued, at least until we've secured enough corroborating evidence that your testimony isn't the only thing holding this case together. Could be weeks, could be months. Margaret felt Caleb tense beside her. Weeks away from the mountain, away from the cabin and the trap lines and the life they'd built. It would mean lost income, possibly lost opportunities. The summer was when Caleb did most of his hunting and trapping, when he built up the stores that would carry them through winter. But before she could speak, Caleb nodded. We'll stay. You're sure? Morrison asked. This won't be pleasant. We're sure, Margaret said firmly. Morrison gathered the documents carefully, locked them in a safe behind his desk. I'll start the investigation tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you find somewhere to stay. Somewhere public, with witnesses. Somewhere that makes it very obvious if anything happens to you. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a formidable widow named Mrs. Patterson, who took one look at them and assigned them her best room without discussion. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and windows that overlooked the street. After months in the cabin, it felt both luxurious and confining. That first night in Denver, they lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of city life. Horses passing on the street, voices from the saloon 3 doors down, the general hum of humanity pressed close together. Margaret was acutely aware of Caleb beside her, closer than they'd been even during the storm when they'd huddled for warmth. The bed was narrow enough that they couldn't avoid touching, shoulders and arms pressed together. You can't sleep, Caleb said after an hour of her restless shifting. Too much noise, too many people. I've gotten used to the mountain quiet. Me too. He was silent for a moment. We can still leave, you know. Just get on the horses and ride west till we hit California. Start over where Thornton can't find us. Is that what you want? I want you safe. Everything else is negotiable. Margaret turned toward him in the darkness, able to make out only the outline of his face. When I came to that mountain, I had nothing. No money, no family, no future. You gave me a home. You gave me a partnership. You gave me back my dignity. Her voice caught. I won't run anymore, Caleb. I won't let powerful men like Thornton keep taking things from people like us just because they can. She felt rather than saw his smile. You've gotten fierce. The mountain taught me. No, you were always fierce. You just didn't know it yet. His hand found hers in the darkness, and they fell asleep like that, fingers intertwined, 2 people bound by more than just a marriage certificate signed in haste. The next days passed in a blur of legal proceedings and tense waiting. Morrison worked quickly, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing records, building a case that grew stronger with each piece of evidence he uncovered. Thomas, it turned out, had been meticulous in his documentation. Every accusation he'd made could be verified through bank records and falsified invoices. Several of his fellow railroad employees were willing to testify, though they were clearly terrified of retaliation. And through it all, Thornton remained ominously silent. That worries me, Beckett said one afternoon as they met in his office to review the case's progress. Thornton's a fighter. He should be screaming about false accusations, filing countersuits, using his influence to shut this down. Instead, nothing. It's like he's waiting for something. Waiting for what? Margaret asked. That's what concerns me. The answer came 3 days later, delivered in the form of James Garrett, appearing at the boarding house with 2 hired thugs flanking him. Mrs. Patterson met them at the door with a shotgun and instructions to get off her property, but Garrett was insistent. I have an official warrant for Mrs. Stroud's arrest, he announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. She's to be taken into custody pending trial for theft and fraud. Margaret was in the upstairs room when she heard the commotion. She moved to the window and saw the scene unfolding below. Garrett with his warrant, Mrs. Patterson with her shotgun, curious onlookers gathering to watch the drama. Caleb appeared from the stable where he'd been tending the horses. He took in the situation at a glance and moved with deceptive calm to position himself between Garrett and the boarding house entrance. "That warrant's invalid," Caleb said. "The territorial marshal is conducting an investigation that supersedes it." "I have a federal judge's signature," Garrett countered. "It supersedes everything." "Let me see it." Garrett handed over the document with a smirk. Caleb read it slowly, his face betraying nothing, then handed it back. "This is dated yesterday. You couldn't have gotten a federal judge to sign this in one day unless he was already prepared to do it, which means Thornton knew this investigation was coming and had this ready as insurance." "Speculation isn't law, Mr. Stroud." "Neither is corruption, but that doesn't seem to stop Thornton." The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the confrontation. Margaret saw several people she recognized from the marshal's office, from Beckett's building, from shops where they'd bought supplies. Word would spread fast. That was both good and bad. Publicity protected her, but it also meant everyone would be watching when she was arrested. She made a decision. Before Caleb could react, she descended the stairs and stepped out onto the porch. "I'm Margaret Stroud," she said clearly, "and I'm not running from anything." Garrett's expression shifted to satisfaction. "Then you'll come peacefully." "She'll do no such thing," Beckett's voice rang out as the lawyer pushed through the crowd. "That warrant is based on charges that are being investigated as we speak for fraudulent filing. You can't arrest someone for theft when the theft never occurred, and the person making the accusation is himself under investigation for embezzlement." "I have a warrant signed by a federal judge," Garrett repeated. "And I have a motion to dismiss filed this morning with that same judge, citing new evidence in an ongoing investigation." Beckett produced his own papers. "Your warrant is invalid until that motion is heard." "When's the hearing?" Garrett asked, his confidence wavering slightly. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Federal Courthouse." Beckett smiled coldly. "I suggest you be there to defend your employer's baseless accusations." Garrett's face darkened, but he was trapped. In front of this many witnesses, he couldn't simply ignore legal procedure. He nodded curtly and withdrew, his thugs following, but not before he caught Margaret's eye with a look of pure malice. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not." The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in excited whispers. Mrs. Patterson ushered Margaret and Caleb back inside while Beckett followed, his expression grim despite his public victory. "That was well played," Caleb said once they were alone in the boarding house parlor. "But it bought us only 24 hours, Beckett replied. "The judge who signed that warrant is in Thornton's pocket. He'll deny my motion tomorrow, and then they'll have legal grounds to arrest Margaret." "Then we need Morrison to move faster," Margaret said. "He's moving as fast as he can. But building a case against someone like Thornton takes time. We need witnesses to feel safe enough to testify. We need documents authenticated. We need everything to be airtight because we only get one chance at this." "We don't have time," Caleb said flatly. "Thornton's not going to wait for legal proceedings. He tried intimidation with the warrant. When that failed, he'll escalate." "Meaning?" "Meaning he'll try to make the problem go away more permanently." The words hung in the air like a threat made manifest. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach. She'd been naive to think this would stay civilized, that law and justice would protect her from a man who'd already committed murder to hide his crimes. "We need to get back to the mountain," she said suddenly. "We're too vulnerable here. Too exposed." "The marshal said to stay in Denver," Beckett objected. "The marshal can't protect us 24 hours a day, and Denver makes us easy targets. Too many people, too many places for an ambush." She looked at Caleb. "On the mountain, we have the advantage. We know the terrain. We can see anyone coming." Caleb nodded slowly. "She's right. Up there, we're safe. Down here, we're sitting ducks waiting for Thornton to make his move." "But if you leave Denver, the judge will declare you fugitives," Beckett warned. "Only if we don't come back for the hearing," Margaret said. "We'll return tomorrow morning, be in that courtroom at 10 o'clock. But tonight we go where Thornton can't reach us." They left Denver as the sun set, riding hard for the mountains. Beckett had tried to convince them to stay, but even he recognized the logic of their position. Mrs. Patterson had packed them supplies and wished them luck with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who'd seen too many injustices in her life. The ride through the darkness was treacherous, the trail barely visible in the moonlight. But both horses knew the way, and Caleb navigated with the confidence of a man who could find his way home blindfolded. They climbed steadily, leaving the city's lights behind, ascending into the clean silence of the high country. They were perhaps 2 hours from the cabin when Caleb suddenly reined in his horse. "What?" Margaret asked, drawing alongside him. "Someone's been on this trail recently. See those marks?" He pointed to disturbed earth barely visible in the moonlight. "Horse tracks, fresh, heading up toward the cabin." Margaret's heart clenched. Could be anyone. Prospectors, hunters. At night? On a trail that doesn't go anywhere except my cabin? Caleb shook his head. "Someone's up there. And I'd bet my best rifle it's not a friendly visit." They proceeded more carefully now, both of them alert for sounds of ambush. Caleb's hand rested on his rifle, and Margaret found herself checking the knife she'd started carrying at her belt, a habit the mountain had taught her. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, and what they saw made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Smoke. Too much smoke for a normal fire. And light. The flickering orange light of flames. "No," Caleb breathed, and then he was moving, spurring his horse forward with Margaret close behind. They reached the clearing to find the cabin engulfed in fire. Flames roared from the windows and through the roof, consuming everything they'd built. The heat was intense even from 30 yards away, and Margaret could see the structure beginning to collapse inward. Caleb dismounted at a run, but Margaret caught his arm before he could rush toward the burning building. "There's nothing we can do," she said, though her heart was breaking. "It's too far gone." "Everything we have is in there. The supplies, the furs, your things. We're alive. That's what matters." A voice called out from the forest behind them. "Touching sentiment, Mrs. Stroud." They spun to find James Garrett emerging from the trees, flanked by his 2 thugs. All 3 men held pistols aimed directly at Margaret and Caleb. "Mr. Thornton sends his regards," Garrett said pleasantly. "He wanted me to deliver a message about what happens to people who threaten his business interests." "You burned our home," Margaret said, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "I removed a problem. You see, if you're dead, you can't testify. And if your death looks like an accident, a tragic fire in a remote mountain cabin, well, these things happen in the wilderness." "Morrison knows we're here," Caleb said quietly, his hand inching toward his rifle still strapped to his saddle. "Beckett knows. If anything happens to us, it will look exactly like what it is, a terrible accident. The marshal will investigate, find nothing suspicious, and close the case. Thornton will be exonerated of all charges due to lack of witnesses, and life will continue as normal." Garrett smiled. "For everyone except you 2. Margaret felt Caleb tense beside her, recognized the shift in his posture that meant he was preparing to attack. Against 3 armed men, the odds were terrible. But standing here waiting to be executed was worse. "Now," she breathed, barely loud enough for Caleb to hear. Everything happened at once. Caleb lunged for his rifle while simultaneously shoving Margaret toward the cover of the horses. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the mountain quiet. Margaret hit the ground hard, scrambled behind her mare while reaching for the pistol Caleb had insisted she carry. More shots. The sound of someone cursing. The horses screaming and bolting, taking their cover with them. Margaret rolled, came up with the pistol aimed at the nearest thug. She'd never shot at a person before, but the mountain had taught her not to hesitate when survival was at stake. She squeezed the trigger. The pistol kicked hard. The thug staggered, dropped his weapon, clutched his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. Caleb had reached his rifle and was using a fallen log as cover, firing with deadly precision. The second thug went down, and then it was just Garrett, backing toward the trees while firing wildly. "This isn't over," he shouted. "Thornton will—" His threat cut off as Caleb's shot caught him in the leg. Garrett collapsed with a scream, his pistol flying from his hand. The silence that followed was broken only by the roar of the burning cabin and Garrett's moaning. Margaret stood slowly, her hands shaking, the pistol still clutched in her grip. She'd just shot a man. She'd just participated in a gunfight like some character from a dime novel. Caleb was at her side instantly, checking her for injuries. You hurt? No. You? Grazed my arm, but I'll live. He looked at the 3 wounded men, then at the burning cabin. We need to get them secured and get down to Pine Hollow. Get the sheriff up here to witness this. They used rope from Caleb's saddlebag to bind the 3 men, none of whom were in condition to resist. The shoulder-shot thug was unconscious from blood loss, the second one dead, and Garrett alternated between threats and pleas as they tied his hands. Thornton will have you killed for this, he hissed through pain-gritted teeth. You can't touch him. He's too powerful. We'll see, Margaret said coldly. They found the horses a quarter-mile down the trail, spooked but unharmed. Caleb loaded the unconscious thug onto one horse while Margaret kept her pistol trained on Garrett. The dead man they left where he'd fallen, evidence for the sheriff. The ride down to Pine Hollow took 3 hours in the darkness, with their prisoners slowing them down and the trail treacherous. But they made it, arriving just before dawn to pound on the sheriff's door. Sheriff Tom Brennan, a solid man who'd known Caleb for years, took one look at the scene and immediately began organizing a posse to ride up to the cabin. You two all right? He asked while his deputies secured the prisoners. Our home is gone, Margaret said numbly. Everything we built. Everything we had. But you're alive, Brennan said. That counts for something. And you've got witnesses now to Thornton's methods. Garrett and his friend there will hang for murder and arson once they realize testifying against Thornton is their only chance at avoiding the noose. He was right. By noon, with the doctor tending his wounded shoulder and facing a murder charge, the surviving thug began talking. By evening, faced with the choice between hanging for murder or testifying against Thornton, Garrett broke completely. The story that emerged was damning. Thornton had indeed ordered Thomas's death. Poison slipped into his medicine during his final illness. He'd been tracking Margaret since her marriage, waiting for the right moment to silence her permanently. The warrant, the accusations, the legal harassment, all of it had been designed to either discredit her or drive her into a position where she could be eliminated quietly. Morrison arrived from Denver the next morning with Beckett, both men grim-faced and furious. They'd spent the night taking depositions from Garrett and the surviving thug, building a case that now included murder, attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Thornton's been arrested, Morrison told them as they sat in the sheriff's office drinking bitter coffee and trying to process everything that had happened. Federal marshals picked him up an hour ago. With Garrett's testimony and the evidence your husband compiled, we have enough to put him away for the rest of his life. What about the warrant against Margaret? Caleb asked. Dismissed. The judge who signed it is also under investigation for corruption. Morrison looked at Margaret with something like awe. You did it, Mrs. Stroud. You brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory. Margaret didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted and hollow. We lost everything, the cabin, our supplies, everything we'd prepared for winter. Oh, the railroad company has already indicated they'll provide compensation, Beckett said. Once this becomes public, they'll want to distance themselves from Thornton as much as possible. I'd estimate you could expect several $1,000s in damages. Money won't rebuild what we lost, Caleb said quietly. No, Margaret agreed, but it will let us start again. They spent the next week in Pine Hollow, while Morrison wrapped up his investigation and Brennan processed the criminal charges. The town's attitude toward them had shifted dramatically. No longer the odd mountain couple and mail-order bride, they were now heroes who'd stood up to corruption and survived attempted murder. Mary Daniels provided them with a room above the trading post and refused to accept payment. Ruth organized a collection to help them replace essential supplies. Even the miners and prospectors who passed through town contributed what they could. You stood up for what was right, Horace told them one evening. That means something out here. People respect that. On their final day in town, before riding back up to assess the cabin damage, Caleb and Margaret stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to human drama, eternal and unchanging. We could go somewhere else, Caleb said. Use the compensation money to buy land in California or Oregon. Start fresh somewhere without ghosts. Margaret considered it, then shook her head. This is home. The mountain is home. I'm not letting Thornton take that from us, too. The cabin's mostly destroyed. It'll take months to rebuild. Then we rebuild. She turned to face him fully. You told me once that we're partners, that you'd stand with me no matter what came. Well, I'm standing with you now. We'll rebuild the cabin. We'll restock the supplies. We'll survive another winter, together. Caleb's scarred face softened into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Together, he agreed. They rode back up to the mountain that afternoon, prepared to face whatever remained of their home. The cabin was indeed largely destroyed. The walls partially collapsed, the roof gone, everything inside reduced to ash and charred debris. But the stone foundation remained, the root cellar was intact, the lean-to stable had survived. They had a place to start. They made camp in the lean-to that night, huddled together under borrowed blankets, and made plans for the rebuild. It would be hard work. It would take everything they had. But they'd done hard things before. As Margaret drifted off to sleep, she felt Caleb's arm around her shoulders, solid and warm and real. They'd faced down corruption and violence and fire. They'd lost almost everything but each other, and somehow that was enough. The mountain had tested them in ways neither could have imagined. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd proven that two broken people could build something strong together, could fight for each other, could stand against the world and refuse to be destroyed. Tomorrow they would start rebuilding. But tonight they simply held each other and listened to the mountain wind, grateful to be alive, grateful to be together, grateful for the second chance that both of them had earned through courage and determination and love they'd been too afraid to name. The storm had come. They'd weathered it, and now, finally, they could begin to truly live. The rebuilding began with the dawn. Caleb woke Margaret before the sun had fully risen, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his voice quiet in the gray light. Time to get started, he said simply. They broke their fast on bread and dried meat from the supplies Horace had sent up with them, eating in silence while surveying the wreckage that had been their home. In the morning light, the damage looked even worse than it had the night before. The proud cabin reduced to blackened timber and ash, months of careful preparation destroyed in a single malicious act. But Margaret had learned something important over the past months. Dwelling on loss was a luxury the mountain didn't permit. You acknowledged the damage, then you got to work fixing it. We start with clearing the debris, Caleb said, already moving toward the ruins. Anything that's salvageable, we save. Everything else gets moved away from the foundation. We'll need the space clear before we can start rebuilding. They worked through the morning, hauling charred wood away from the stone foundation, sorting through the ashes for anything that had survived the fire. It was heartbreaking work. Margaret kept finding remnants of their life together, small things that triggered memories. A twisted metal fork from their table, the remains of the Dutch oven where she'd learned to bake bread, fragments of the ledger where Caleb had taught her to keep accounts, and in the loft area where the floor had partially collapsed, but some structure remained, she found something that made her throat tight with emotion. The furs that had covered their bed, singed around the edges but largely intact, protected by their position in the corner farthest from the fire's origin. "Caleb!" she called down. He climbed up carefully, testing each beam before putting his weight on it. When he saw what she'd found, his expression softened. "Those were my mother's," he said quietly, touching the furs with careful fingers. "My father traded for them the year I was born. They're the only thing I have from before the war." "They survived," Margaret said. "Like we did." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or recognition that they'd been tested and proven themselves worthy of the life they were trying to build. "Yeah," he agreed. "Like we did." They spent 3 days clearing the site, working from dawn until they could no longer see by firelight. Other help came unexpectedly on the 4th day when Horace arrived with 2 strong miners who'd volunteered their labor, along with a wagon full of supplies. "Town took up a collection," Horace explained, helping unload timber and tools. "Figured you could use some help getting back on your feet." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, we did. What you did, standing up to Thornton, that matters. Out here, people remember when someone has the courage to do the right thing." He handed Caleb a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Also, this came for you from Denver. Legal papers from Beckett." Caleb unwrapped the bundle to reveal official documents and a bank draft. He read through them slowly, his expression growing progressively more stunned. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Compensation from the railroad. Damages for Thomas's death, for the attack on us, for the cabin. He showed her the bank draft, and Margaret's breath caught. $3,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. That's enough to rebuild twice over, she whispered. With plenty left for supplies and stock for the next 2 years, Caleb added. He looked at Horace. This is real? This is legitimate? Beckett says the railroad wants this settled quietly and quickly. They're terrified of what else might come out if there's a prolonged trial. Thornton's crimes have exposed all kinds of corruption in their organization. They're trying to clean house and make amends to anyone hurt by his actions. Margaret sank down on a stack of timber, the enormity of it washing over her. They weren't just going to survive, they were going to thrive. They could rebuild the cabin better than before, buy proper tools, stock enough supplies to weather any storm, maybe even hire help for the hardest work. There's more, Horace said, pulling out additional papers. Thornton's trial is set for next month. Morrison needs you both to come to Denver to testify. Says it'll be the final nail in his coffin, having you tell your story in front of the territorial court. Caleb looked at Margaret, his expression questioning. They'd talked about this, whether they'd be willing to face Thornton again, to stand in a courtroom and relive everything they'd endured. We'll go, Margaret said firmly. We'll testify. Thomas deserves that much. We deserve that much. With the miners' help, the work progressed rapidly. They cleared and leveled the site, then began laying new foundation timbers on top of the original stone base. Caleb proved to be a skilled carpenter, measuring and cutting with precision, explaining each step to Margaret and the helpers so they could work efficiently. The cabin needs to be bigger this time, he said one evening as they sat around the fire reviewing plans he'd sketched on salvaged paper. We had barely enough room before. Now, with proper funding, we can build something more substantial. How big? Margaret asked. 2 rooms on the main floor instead of 1. A proper bedroom instead of just the loft. Maybe a covered porch where we can sit in the evenings. He glanced at her almost shyly. Make it more of a home instead of just a survival shelter. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest. A proper home. A place built not just for endurance, but for living. I'd like that. A real kitchen area, too, with space for a proper stove once we can afford one. We can afford one now. Caleb tapped the bank draft, which he'd locked in the root cellar for safekeeping. We can afford a lot of things. They worked through June and into July, the cabin taking shape piece by piece. The walls rose, solid and strong, made from timber that Caleb and the miners cut from the forest and milled by hand. The roof went on, properly pitched this time, to handle the heavy mountain snows. Windows were installed, real glass windows bought from Denver, luxury items that transformed the interior with natural light. Margaret threw herself into the work with fierce determination. She'd learned so much over the past months, how to handle tools, how to read measurements, how to anticipate what was needed before being asked. She worked alongside the men without complaint, earning their respect through competence and endurance. Your wife's tougher than most men I know, one of the miners told Caleb admiringly. Mountains made her strong. She was always strong, Caleb replied. The mountain just gave her a chance to prove it. By late July, the cabin was habitable. Not finished, there was still interior work to be done, details to complete, but solid enough to move back into. The miners returned to Pine Hollow with thanks and payment for their labor, leaving Caleb and Margaret alone on the mountain for the first time since the fire. They stood together in the doorway of the new cabin, looking out at the valley below as the sun set behind the western peaks. It's better than before, Margaret said. Stronger. Like us, Caleb agreed. That night they slept in their new bedroom, a real room with a door and windows and space for more than just a bed. The furs that had survived the fire covered the new mattress they'd purchased, connecting past and present. Margaret lay in the darkness listening to Caleb's steady breathing, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Safety. Home. The summons to Denver came in early August. Morrison's office sent an official letter requesting their presence at Thornton's trial, scheduled for the 3rd week of the month. They made the journey down from the mountain on a clear morning, the new cabin secure behind them, their lives finally stable enough to face the past one final time. Denver had changed in the months since they'd last been there, or perhaps they had changed and saw it differently. The city seemed smaller, less intimidating. They checked into Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, where the formidable widow greeted them with fierce hugs and declarations that she'd followed every detail of the case in the newspapers. "You're famous," she announced. "The widow who brought down a railroad baron. They're writing about you as far east as Chicago." Margaret wasn't sure how she felt about that. Fame had never been her goal. Justice had been. But she supposed if their story inspired other people to stand up against corruption, that was worthwhile. The trial began on a sweltering Monday morning. The courthouse was packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. Thornton sat at the defense table in expensive clothes that couldn't hide the fact that he looked diminished, his power stripped away by exposure. Margaret took the stand on the second day, her hand steady on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp young attorney named Williams who'd been specially appointed to handle the case, led her through her testimony with careful precision. "Mrs. Stroud, please tell the court about your late husband's work with the Union Railroad Company." Margaret spoke clearly, describing Thomas's discovery of the embezzlement, his meticulous documentation, his attempt to report the crimes before his sudden illness and death. She described her years of poverty afterward, her desperate journey west, her attempt to build a new life. "And when did you first become aware that Mr. Thornton was targeting you?" "When his agent, James Garrett, appeared in Pine Hollow with false accusations of theft. When he tried to have me arrested on fabricated charges. When he and his men burned our home and attempted to murder both myself and my husband." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton's lawyer objected strenuously, but Morrison had already entered Garrett's confession into evidence. The lawyer's protests rang hollow. Caleb testified after Margaret, his account of the attack at the cabin delivered in stark, unemotional terms that somehow made it more powerful. He described finding their home in flames, the confrontation with Garrett, the gunfight that had left one man dead and provided the evidence that had finally broken Thornton's conspiracy. "Mr. Stroud," Williams asked, "why do you think Mr. Thornton went to such extreme lengths to silence your wife?" "Because she had the truth," Caleb said simply. "And truth is the one thing powerful men like him can't control or buy." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified to Thornton's crimes. Railroad employees he'd intimidated, business partners he'd defrauded, the doctor who'd been bribed to provide the poison that killed Thomas. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, impossible to refute. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, Margaret felt something release in her chest. Not triumph, exactly. More like the settling of accounts, the balancing of scales that had been weighted wrong for too long. Thornton was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. As they left the courthouse after sentencing, a journalist from the Denver Post stopped them on the steps. "Mrs. Stroud, how does it feel to have brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory?" Margaret considered the question. "It feels like justice. Delayed, but finally served." "What will you do now?" She looked at Caleb, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "We're going home. Back to our mountain. Back to our life." "You're not concerned about retaliation?" "Thornton has associates, people who might—" "The mountain takes care of its own," Caleb interrupted. "We'll be fine." They left Denver the next morning, eager to return to the high country. The journey up the trail felt like shedding weight with each mile gained in elevation, the complications and politics of civilization falling away, replaced by the honest simplicity of rock and sky and wind. When the cabin came into view, solid and strong against the mountainside, Margaret felt her heart lift. This was home now. Not the boarding house in St. Louis where she'd counted pennies and waited to disappear. Not the temporary lodging in Denver where she'd testified and confronted her past. But here, in this place they'd built together through sweat and sacrifice and determination. They fell back into their routine with the ease of long practice, but something had shifted. The partnership that had begun as practical necessity had deepened into something neither of them had quite acknowledged until now. It was Margaret who finally gave voice to it one evening in early September as they sat on the new porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "I love you," she said quietly. "I don't know when it happened, somewhere between the first blizzard and the fire and the trial. But I do." I love you." Caleb was silent for so long that Margaret began to fear she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd broken some unspoken rule of their arrangement. But then he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Didn't think I could anymore. Thought the war had burned that out of me along with everything else. But you," he shook his head, "you brought me back to life, made me remember what it feels like to care about something more than just survival." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "We found each other at the end of the world, and built something stronger than either of us could have built alone." That night, for the first time since their marriage, they came together not as partners bound by necessity, but as husband and wife bound by choice and love. Their joining was tentative at first, both of them worn by life and uncertain of intimacy after so long alone. But tenderness and patience won out, and what they discovered in each other's arms was not the passionate fire of youth, but something deeper. The steady warmth of two souls finally finding home. Autumn came to the mountain in a blaze of gold and crimson, the aspens transforming the slopes into a tapestry of color. Margaret worked to preserve food for the winter, canning vegetables from their expanded garden, smoking meat from Caleb's successful hunts, drying herbs and berries. The root cellar filled with stores, the cabin lined with supplies. They were more prepared for winter than they'd ever been, with money in the bank for emergencies and a home built to withstand any storm. In October, Mary and Horace made the climb up to visit, bringing news from town and gifts from well-wishers. A new cast-iron stove that made Margaret actually weep with joy, warm blankets, books for the long winter nights. "You've done well for yourselves," Mary said, looking around the cabin with approval. "This is a real home now." "It is," Margaret agreed, "though we couldn't have done it without help from the town." "Town's proud of you both," Horace said. "What you did standing up to Thornton, it mattered to people, made them believe that ordinary folks could fight back against corruption and win." After they left, Margaret stood in her warm kitchen with its proper stove and shelves full of supplies, and marveled at how far she'd come. Less than a year ago, she'd been desperate and alone, answering a letter from a stranger because she had no other options. Now she had a home, a husband she loved, a life that felt rich despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. The first snow came in November, gentle flakes that promised the long white season ahead. Margaret and Caleb had spent the afternoon chopping wood to add to their already substantial stockpile, working side by side with the comfortable rhythm they'd developed. As they came inside to warm themselves by the fire, Caleb pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that still sometimes surprised her. "You warm enough?" he asked. "With you here?" "Always." "Good. Because I've been thinking—" He paused, seemed to gather his courage. "About next spring. About maybe building an addition to the cabin." "We just finished building this one," Margaret laughed. "I know, but I was thinking a nursery, just in case." He touched her face gently. "I know we're not young. I know it might not happen. But if it did—" Margaret's breath caught. They'd never discussed children, both of them assuming that door had closed with age and circumstance. But now, looking at his hopeful expression, she felt possibility unfurl. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Whether it happens or not, I'd like to try." His smile was radiant, transforming his scarred face into something beautiful. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Winter settled over the mountain like a benediction, the world transformed into white silence and crystalline beauty. Margaret and Caleb spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from the books Mary had brought, playing cards, planning improvements for the spring. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. On the longest night of the year, Caleb surprised Margaret with a gift, a wooden box he'd carved during his time alone on the trapline, its lid decorated with an intricate scene of mountains and forest. "For keeping things safe," he said as she traced the carving with wondering fingers. "Important things. Precious things." Margaret opened the box to find it lined with soft leather. It was perfect, a place to keep Thomas's recovered documents, the letters from their courtship, the legal papers that had finally brought them justice, the tangible proof of their journey. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you." There's something else, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a simple gold band worn smooth with age. This was my mother's. I want you to have it. Should have given it to you when we married, but we were strangers then. Now, he slipped it onto her finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. Now you're my wife in every way that matters. Margaret looked at the ring, then at the man who'd given it to her, and felt her heart overflow. I don't have anything to give you. You gave me everything. You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. You gave me a future. You gave me love when I thought I'd forgotten how to feel it. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. You gave me a home. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, snow falling thick and heavy. But inside they were warm and safe, and together, two people who'd found each other at the end of the world and built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Spring came late to the mountains that year, winter holding on with stubborn determination until April finally brought thaw and renewal. As the snow melted and the first green shoots pushed through the earth, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Caleb one morning as they worked in the garden, planting seeds for the season ahead. He froze, his hands full of soil, his face cycling through shock and wonder and joy. You're sure? As sure as I can be. Mary helped me confirm it when we were in town last week. He stood slowly, crossed to where she knelt in the dirt, and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that spoke of awe and terror in equal measure. I'm 54 years old, he said. I'm going to be an old father. And I'm 46, an old mother. But we'll manage. We've managed everything else. We have, haven't we? He laughed, the sound pure and joyful. We really have. The summer passed in a blur of preparation. They built the nursery addition Caleb had imagined, a small room off the main bedroom with a window facing east to catch the morning sun. Margaret sewed tiny clothes from fabric Mary sent up from town, her hands moving with the same precision she'd learned from months of mountain work. Her pregnancy was not easy. The altitude made her breathless, the physical demands of mountain life exhausting. But Caleb shouldered more of the work without complaint, insisting she rest when needed, treating her with a protective tenderness that made her love him even more. In September, a full year after they'd returned from Thornton's trial, Margaret went into labor. Mary had come up to the cabin 2 weeks earlier to help, and she guided Margaret through the long hours with experienced hands and encouraging words. Caleb paced outside like a caged animal until Mary finally ordered him to be useful and boil water, fetch supplies, make himself helpful instead of anxious. The baby was born just before dawn, a daughter with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined expression. Caleb held her with shaking hands, his scarred face wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. She's perfect, he whispered. She's ours, Margaret replied, exhausted but radiant. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's mother. And as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the peaks gold and rose, they sat together in their cabin, husband and wife and daughter, and marveled at the life they'd built. 2 years later, as Sarah took her first tottering steps across the cabin floor, another letter arrived from Samuel Beckett in Denver. The railroad had authorized additional compensation, a generous settlement acknowledging the full extent of harm caused by Thornton's conspiracy. Along with the money came an offer. The railroad wanted to name a new station in the mountains after Thomas Whitmore, acknowledging his courage in exposing corruption. Margaret read the letter twice, then handed it to Caleb. What do you think? I think your first husband deserves to be remembered. He was a brave man who died for doing the right thing. Caleb looked at Sarah, who was attempting to climb into her mother's lap. And I think our daughter should know about him when she's old enough. About the man whose courage made it possible for her parents to find each other and build this life. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. For Thomas, whose integrity had cost him his life. For Caleb, whose strength had saved hers. For the mountain that had tested them and made them stronger. For the daughter who represented their future. She'd come to this mountain desperate and alone, a widow seeking any refuge from a world that had no place for her. She'd married a stranger in a practical arrangement built on necessity rather than love. But somewhere between the blizzards and the gunfights, the building and the rebuilding, the trials and the triumphs, That practical arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had believed possible. They'd found love, found home, found themselves. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to ask questions, they would tell her the whole story. About the grandfather she'd never met who'd been a hero. About the grandmother who'd climbed a mountain to marry a stranger. About the railroad baron who'd tried to destroy them and the courage it had taken to fight back. But for now, on this golden autumn afternoon, they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their kingdom. Sarah played at their feet with wooden toys Caleb had carved. The cabin stood solid behind them, smoke rising from the chimney. The root cellar was full, the woodpile stacked high, the trap lines prepared for winter. They were ready. For whatever came. For winter's fury and spring's renewal. For the challenges and joys that lay ahead. Two broken people had climbed a mountain and found each other. Had fought for justice and won. Had built a home from nothing but determination and love. And high in the unforgiving mountains above Pine Hollow, where the air was thin and the winters cruel and only the strong survived, Caleb and Margaret Stroud had proven that sometimes the most practical arrangements could transform into the most profound love stories. Their journey had begun with a letter and a desperate gamble. It had led them through fire and fear, through loss and triumph, through darkness and into light. And now, finally, they were home. Not just on the mountain, but in each other's hearts, where they would remain for all the days of their lives. The mountain wind sang around them, carrying the scent of pine and possibility, and in its voice they heard the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Together, they had survived. Together, they had prevailed. And together, high above the world, they had built something that would last. Not just a cabin or a life, but a legacy of courage and love that would endure long after the mountains themselves had worn away. This was their story. This was their mountain. This was their home. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.